Welcome to Abolition Democracy 613. Our topic today is the abolition of capital and the abolition of capitalism. And we approach the topic, once again, through the lens of W.E.B. Du Bois's idea of abolition democracy. As we discussed at the last seminar on the abolition of property, there are multiple points of convergence between Du Bois's writings on the failure of Reconstruction, understood as the counter-revolution of propertied interests and capitalism, and the struggle for economic justice and equality. In our seminar, we will be focusing on the writings of the Frankfurt School on late-stage capitalism, and especially on the form of capitalism that National Socialism took in Germany during the 1920s, 30s, and early 40s. To immediately set the stage for the imbrication of issues of slavery, totalitarianism, and capitalism, let me begin with a short passage from the essay by Friedrich Pollock that you read for the seminar today. Pollock, one of the founders and directors of the Institute for Social Research, in this article published in 1941 called State Capitalism, where he writes, "In the last century, it became evident that a society based on slave labor could not exist side by side with one organized on the principle of free labor. The same holds true in our day for democratic and totalitarian societies." According to Pollock and other members of the Frankfurt School, the only way to defeat German National Socialism, which had proved itself so economically efficient, was to demonstrate the greater economic efficiency of democracies. The only way to defeat authoritarianism and oppression was to model economic success based on freedom. Now, we'll be focusing on the writings of the Frankfurt School, and in this context, I'm delighted to be joined again by Professor Martin Saar, Professor of Social Philosophy at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. As in the past 2 years at this time, this seminar is co-hosted and is a joint seminar with Martin Saar's colloquium. And under normal circumstances, as we were for the past 2 years, we would be in the library of the Institute for Social Research. It's an honor again, Martin, thanks for joining me, to jointly host this seminar, perhaps even more authentic, since we are in effect at the same time now simultaneously virtually at the Frankfurt School and at the Frankfurt School in exile here at Columbia University. As you all know, Professor Martin Saar specializes in contemporary social philosophy with a focus on Spinoza, Nietzsche, Marx, Foucault, critical theory, and post-structuralism. He holds the chair in social philosophy that both Jürgen Habermas and Axel Honneth held, and that Horkheimer as well held for a period at the university at Frankfurt. He is the author of several books, including Genealogy as Critique, History and Theory of the Subject After Nietzsche and Foucault, published in 2007, and The Immanence of Power, Political Theory After Spinoza, published in 2013. Welcome back, Martin. And in order to frame this seminar properly within the context of abolition democracy, Martin and I have invited the remarkable, innovative, truly transformative opera company, Heartbeat Opera, to open the seminar. In a powerful adaptation of Beethoven's opera Fidelio, the pioneering opera company, Heartbeat Opera, placed Beethoven's libretto squarely in our times of racial injustice, of racialized mass incarceration, police violence. The opera was recast the way I interpreted it at Rikers Island, and the plot was changed to adjust it to our times of Black Lives Matter protest and the police crackdown on the movement. Unable to continue performing Fidelio live because of the pandemic, Heartbeat Opera has now put together a digital opera, Breathing Free, that builds on their work, on what I consider to be their abolitionist work. I'm delighted to welcome the creators, or some of the creators, because it's an enormous team. Three of the co-creators of the groundbreaking Breathing Free program: Filmmaker Anaiis Cisco, creative director Ras Dia, and director adapter Ethan Hurd. Thanks for joining me today. A few words about each of you before we begin the discussion. Anaiis Cisco is a filmmaker and a professor of film and media studies at Smith College. Professor Cisco teaches digital video production and develops media that explores the emotional and internal journeys of Black characters confronting intimate moments of violence and trauma in diverse story worlds. She blends together in her film work social justice, racial justice, and aesthetics, as you will see. Her short films have been screened at dozens of film festivals, including Outfest, Newfest, and Raindance. And she is the filmmaker for Breathing Free. Welcome. Ras Dia is the creative producer of Breathing Free. He's an arts producer and curator, and he specializes in multidisciplinary arts programming. He's also the programming director of Thresh, a New York-based female-led performing arts organization bridging Indian and Western performing arts. And he's the assistant producer of the Metropolitan Opera's Peabody and Emmy award-winning Live in HD series. So welcome, Ras. And Ethan Hurd is the founding co-artistic director of Heartbeat Opera. The co is with Lisa Proske. And now I think we're starting to have a long collaboration over several years now, in part thanks to the Eric Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights, which has been helping to support your amazing work. Ethan adapted, directed, and co-wrote the new English dialogue and adaptation of Fidelio. He's worked on many of the productions at Heartbeat, Lady M, La Susanna, Butterfly, Kafka Fragments, Six Drag Extravaganzas, and other performances. He teaches acting and directing at the Yale School of Drama, Yale Institute of Sacred Music, and Princeton University's Lewis Center for the Arts. So welcome, Ethan. Welcome, everyone, to this panel. I'd like to begin with you, Ethan, actually, to help introduce your Fidelio, which was the first production that then kind of which then gave rise to Breathing Free, in part because of our difficult circumstances today, and to get a sense of what you were thinking of creating with that transformation of Beethoven's Fidelio as a way to introduce the segment that we're going to watch in a moment. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Bernard and Martin, for having us. It's a pleasure to be here, especially on the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's baptism, December 17th, 1770.
Okay. All right.
You know, in 2018, we were thinking as a company about how to make socially conscious art. And I thought back to Fidelio, which is a piece in grad school that we had studied in set design class. Mm-hmm. And I had seen maybe 8 set designers design the prison. And so those images actually were kind of emblazoned in my mind. And as we just started discussing this opera, it was very clear to me from the beginning that it should be an American contemporary adaptation, that we should really think of Stan as a Black Lives Matter activist and think of Pizarro, the warden, as a white supremacist, as a corrupt warden. And that would explain their backstory, which in the original opera is not very explicit, the Pizarro-Florestan relationship. But then the big question was, how would we do the Prisoner's Chorus, which is this central, iconic musical moment of the opera? Heartbeat is a small company. We typically distill grand opera into a black box, you know, for 200 audience members and maybe 7 instrumentalists and 7 singers. So we asked ourselves this rather audacious question: might there be the possibility of a collaboration with prison choirs. And our co-music director, Dan, had a relationship with a prison choir conductor in Minneapolis. And we reached out to Amanda Weber, and she connected us with Kathy and Kirk and Mary in Iowa and Kansas and in Ohio. And over the course of months, we gradually built relationships with 6 prison choirs and more than 100 incarcerated singers and 70 outside volunteer singers who come into the prisons weekly, usually. And with very humble hearts, Dan and I traveled to Iowa, Kansas, and Ohio, and were able to record rehearsal and film. And Dan made an SATB vocal arrangement for male and female voices. And miraculously, this recording came together with a lot of grace, a lot of beautiful contributions from these choirs. And it was a much deeper, richer, bigger experience and movement than we ever could have anticipated. We ended up exchanging letters with incarcerated singers, and personally, I was transformed by getting to not only walk inside prisons for the first time, but meet incarcerated folks and learn really about their experience a little bit, and what music and art and what this song means to them. So that's a little bit.
It was, yeah. I mean, I can understand how transformative it must have been for you to work on this, and I'll confess that it's transformative to me every time I see your production of the choir. And so let's go into the prisoners' choir right now, and then talk about it, because I think that there's a way in which one needs to experience it first in order to speak about it properly, because it is really so transformative. Fonda, could you please play the segment which is from Heartbeat Opera's Fidelio? And so it's a live opera that all of a sudden goes to this video. That is one of the most powerful, to me, abolitionist moments when that choir begins to play. And it's something about the emotion, the mixture of emotion of transcendence but it's something about kind of the emotion of transcendence in contrast to the prison, right? Somehow emotionally, as I listen to this, I feel as if I'm about to transcend the space that within which the choirs are singing in prison. Was it? I mean, we can talk about what a remarkable way this moment is in the production as a disruption, actually, of the physical production of everything else. Of course, is physical, and then all of a sudden we go to this video. But I find this an incredible abolitionist piece. Were you thinking of it that way originally?
I think the honest answer is no. So much of working on Fidelio and now working on Breathing Free is a process of self-education for me and opening my awareness to the harsh realities and injustices of our country, our world, our systems. I didn't know much about our carceral system before starting to create our version of Fidelio. And I would say my eyes are more open now to the gross injustice that our system is perpetrating on a daily basis. And I would say Breathing Free maybe is moving toward an abolitionist message and mission.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and we should talk about Breathing Free, because in part, and Martin, feel free to jump in as you like. In part, Breathing Free was the product of the pandemic and not being able to kind of perform the Fidelio live. One fascinating issue here has to do with the place of opera in culture, and we put on the website a couple of articles about Fidelio, one by Adorno, it's about opera more generally, and one by Edward Said, specifically on Fidelio. And I mean, one of the interesting critiques of Fidelio, which I think one hears, and it's not just a critique of opera, but a critique of Fidelio, is the notion of justice that is contained in the original libretto, which I think is a very retributive notion of justice. And of course, you change that completely, right? Ethan, so before we get to Breathing, you
we did change the ending. Yes,
maybe it's like spoiler alert, for everybody who's going to go see the opera, but the ending is dramatic.
I'll say that, we didn't want it to be a happy ending. We did not want to tie it in a bow and say Leonora, or Leah in our case, she didn't solve the problem, that this is an ongoing huge problem. And in fact, in our version, she wakes up from a dream and realizes she was fantasizing this rescue mission, and she has not succeeded in rescuing her husband yet.
The ending kind of threw me off my chair, literally, really. I have to admit, it's just stunning, but a total transformation, really, in response to kind of an Adornian critique of opera, or Edward Said's veiled critique of the ending of it's a total transformation of it, which, yes, you're right, it was all a dream, right? It didn't happen, So you weren't able to perform it, to continue to perform it, and so Ras, you helped create a different, something different, and Anaiis as well, and of course Ethan. I mean, you all and all of the people who have been involved in this extraordinary work and this incredible team. We put in the chat box the libretto and the digital program. So please, everyone, go to the digital program to see everyone who participated in this extraordinary production. But Ras, tell us what you were thinking when you were pushing Fidelio in this new direction.
Yeah, first I have to say it was such a thrill to be asked to be a part of this project because of the kind of beautifully unknown. It was an opportunity to make space in something that has historically been racist, and make a stake for the claim of humanity and humanizing the people represented in it. We know when Beethoven wrote Fidelio, the transatlantic slave trade was at its apex. And so for me, as a producer, understanding the context of Beethoven's opera about justice and freedom, at the same time, my ancestors were in shackles and beholden to the plantation. So representing opera as a space that is not only humanizing, but also a point of liberation for Black creators, Black activists, was kind of a through line for me. I was given this wonderful libretto of spirituals and art songs, and then of course the Fidelio excerpts. And it kind of fell to me to figure out, well, what are the ways that we can contextualize this? And we knew we had this amazing filmmaker taking part, so we knew we didn't want it to just be something that people filmed on their iPhones and then we stitched it together, but we really wanted to create a kind of cinematic language that not only challenged assumptions about Black creators in opera, but also held space for them. And that's really important. We talked a lot in our process about empowering artists, empowering Black artists more than, you know, the idea of accusation and guilt. And so we wanted to represent not only the trauma that's represented in the idea of mass incarceration and its impact on people of color, but also the joy, the liberation, the community building, the sensuality, the skin. And if you see the visual album, you'll understand that it was about representing Black people as not being monolithic. And we also wanted to represent the idea of intersection. If we're taking the idea of Fidelio and incarceration and transplanting it to the idea of mass incarceration in America, we know that that disproportionately affects BIPOC folk. And so the idea is, well, here's an opportunity to approach a specific subject that's related to organizations that are doing the kind of stakeholding work on the groundwork, the Innocence Project, Color of Change, the New York City Police Department, the LGBTQ Freedom Fund, people who have a stake in the experiences of the Black community, but not necessarily opera. And so my job was kind of finding a way to will that into a conversation, will Breathing Free as a point of access to the issues that Black folk face.
And of course, all within the framework of this, our understanding, of course, of breathing, right? Of breathing, of the famous last words of Eric Garner, the famous last words of George Floyd, right? Yeah. I think Anaiis, I'd love you to introduce the clip we're going to see, because I find the film spectacular right there. But before I do, Martin, I don't want to. I keep on not creating enough space. If you wanted to jump in.
No, it's just one thing I would be interested in, and it's something that is striking me more than anyone else of you. How did you manage the language thing? That you have these people sing in a language they don't speak and probably haven't understood before you translated the lines for them. Was this an estrangement, or was this a way also to bring something in that would not have been there otherwise?
Absolutely. I would say that we asked the prison choir conductors we were in touch with, would you like to sing it in German? Would your singers like to learn the German, or should we do an English translation? And all of the conductors checked in with their choirs, and the choirs across the board said, let's learn the German. One of them had actually sung this song before, the Kansas choir. But for everyone else, German was brand new. And in the letters they wrote to us afterward, incarcerated singers were saying this was a joy to learn the German. And it was a challenge that we felt so proud of ourselves for tackling. And I heard from the Ohio choirs that ultimately members of the choir were using the German as a kind of code or a kind of, language, a club, inner circle language in the hallways of the facility after learning it.
Wow, I love that idea. I love that idea. How we, right? How our, those of us who had foreign parents would use different languages as a way to not let the children understand what's going on, right? And coding, yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah, it is stunning. I mean, it is. Yes, I mean the juxtaposition of the German and of the music itself and of the confinement of the prison is this stunning juxtaposition, which somehow it just sends shivers down my spine. Amazing. So, Ras, you were telling us about the next production, which is Breathing Free, and we're going to look at one particular segment from it. I think this is a kind of a sneak preview. I know that it played for six performances, I believe, already, and it will continue to play, but at this point, I think that we're the only ones who are going to be able to see this this segment. And Anaiis, tell us a little bit about it and how you approach the filming of it.
Yeah, sure. So what we will watch today is a medley of Stan's aria and Malcolm X's aria. And it's a very unconventional style of situating these two arias together. Also, I just want to preface that I have no background in classical music, specifically opera. So learning about the structuring of how the music was composed was also helpful for me in thinking about how I wanted to orchestrate this when I get into the edit. So what we'll see is basically Stan's solo moment of him being imprisoned and then calling out in this way, and it's sandwiched right after Leah's aria. So we see Leah kind of have this dreamlike experience reaching for Stan, who we then see is situated in prison. And we also juxtapose Malcolm X's aria, and how we were trying to imagine this connection is that Stan's in one prison, but Malcolm X is possibly in another prison on another block, and making the cement or the locations that we were afforded kind of really connect the pieces. So we'll watch just Stan and Malcolm X's aria, which is followed by Motherless Child. And I think it's important to talk about the bookends of these pieces, because it's really one cohesive piece of music that is informed by the beginning and the end of, or the past and the present of those songs that are placed right before and after. But this is Stan and Malcolm X's aria, and I look forward to talking to more about the ways we were able to execute some of the filmic styles and choices in this piece.
I think we only, I think Ethan, we only have the Malcolm X one, right?
I'm sorry to say we only have time today for Malcolm X, but I appreciate Anaiis putting in context.
Exactly.
Because in Breathing Free,
yeah,
we did see Stan on either side.
And,
so this is from Anthony Davis's.
Before we jump into it, though, where are we exactly, Anaiis? Where did you shoot this? Where did Ras decide to shoot this?
We are all working with very limited locations. So our actors are dispersed throughout the country. So one's in LA, one's in Chicago, and one's in New York. Unfortunately, we weren't physically able to go to the LA shoot, but had a heavy hand in just coordinating what those shots and setups would be based on the direction of Ethan and what he imagined for that isolated moment. And we knew that it was going to be a direct address to the audience. And how could we frame that? How could we also make that connect and not just be a Malcolm X moment, but something that is linking us to other Black men also in similar situations? And so that is
what, the Malcolm X one is down at Foley Square in New York City.
No, it's a mix. So it's in LA and it's in New York. So part of it is in a garage of one of the actors, where we're filming against the cement wall to kind of make that location connection. And then the other parts are the dancing sequences that happen at Foley Square. And why I chose Foley Square, one, because of, again, that cement texture and trying to link all of these spaces, but also knowing that the Supreme Court is situated there. And when we went there, we thought that we could just walk on up the stairs and use the columns. We were like, it's COVID. No one's going to be there. There were skaters there. And then also there were barricades around those buildings, protecting them with police presence there. So we were just only able to be situated in Foley Square, and knowing like the history of that space. Like I've attended May Day protests there in terms of labor rights, specifically at that location. So returning just felt right. And also just thinking about the textures that we are playing with to make that story stronger is why we chose.
It is at the heart of the quote unquote justice system right there. Right there, you're looking at actually the federal courthouse in back, the state courthouse is on the side, but the United States District Court for the Southern District, the Second Circuit is right there. The building behind the dancers, it's stunning. Okay, let's go into it. Fonda, could you please play the clip And let's put the words. I'll try and put the words in the chat from the libretto.
Hear my truth. You want the story, but you don't want to know. My truth is you've been on me a very long time. Longer than I can say. You'll never run the ball. My truth told me wait before you start. My truth told me staying alive is all you've got. I shined your shoes, I sawed your top, hard your good leg, played with hustler's hope. But the crime is mine. I will do to your time so you can sleep. I won't be out to get you on the street at night, but I won't forget any evil that's white. My truth is a hammer coming from the back. It will beat you down when you least expect. I would not tell you what I know. You want the truth. You want the truth. You want the truth. But you don't want to know.
Stunning, 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 utter transformation of opera. Really, it's groundbreaking, transformative of the operatic form. I really feel. Thank you, first of all, for creating that. Amazing. And incredibly powerful. So Ras, how does that fit? That particular sequence then fit into the longer trajectory of breathing free?
Yeah. So that moment is, as Anaiis mentioned, this kind of we'll say spectrum of Black men, the Black experience. We're trying to build a sense of the continuum of the history of Black folks in this country. And that moment is the most, I would say, explicit connection that we draw in the piece. We have other moments, certainly from the use of spirituals, Negro spirituals, that we use to contextualize a modern millennial experience. We had the artists film themselves and Anaiis stitched those together as these kind of soliloquy videos responding to the spiritual itself. And so we're trying to build not only the sense of continuum, but the sense of variety, that people may have, the same information and experience it a different way. And so that piece functions as a kind of, I guess it's like a hierarchical moment there, in that we're bridging together not only the fact that people have had these experiences for 4 centuries in this country, but also that they've been individuals the entire time. It's been very specific in particular. There isn't an umbrella or a broad or whitewashing that can happen in the way that people live through their trauma.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that is right. I mean, one really does get a sense through that piece of the different experiences and histories of racial injustice. The scene that looks like it's from the Fidelio dungeon actually feels like the bottom of a slave ship as well, right? And the running in the street is the police violence, is the police killing today, and it's a remarkable connection of all of these different historical injustices and their legacy. You were just telling me, Ethan, that Brian Stevenson had gotten in touch to say how remarkable the production was, and I understand completely, because it is exactly the kind of work that Brian is doing down with the Legacy Museum and the Lynching Memorial, which is to tie together these horrid stages of racial injustice.
And
go ahead.
you see that with the dancers and the use of Stan. Like, I tried to create this space where Stan's underground, but the dancers are trying to reach him. And we were trying to think of where are some prisons situated. And we know that the Supreme Court also has like these prison-like spaces under where they're handling their business. And so just trying to rescue him, not just only seeing him in a sense of torture, but also allowing there to be a instance of escape, even if it's internally, because that's how we're experiencing Stan's freeness, is this internal escape that he's going through in this piece. But also there's people on the outside trying to connect with him, also trying to free him historically. And so that was also something that I was considering and trying to piece together these 4 different characters who are experiencing different forms of oppression in this moment. One chooses to dance, one chooses to sing out, the other is directly using anger and assertion to address their audience.
Yeah, right. Of course, I had spoken about the trail, the legacy of injustice, but this is also such a powerful piece about resistance, about fighting back, about getting outside, about trying to transform the world, which of course, what the whole Breathing Free project is such a transformative project, a form of resistance to all of these injustices. Utterly brilliant. You and your co-creators have produced something that is stunning, brilliant, moving, transcending, historically important, but also transformative, really, of the form, I think, of the operatic form. So thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
that.
you for having us.
I'm coming from a very similar institution of classical cinema, where they've excluded tons of Black folks or put us in positions of being oppressed, even in some of the character types they've chosen for us. And so to be able to develop this new genre where people are responding and embracing Black artists singing opera music is just extraordinary. So I really appreciate the responses and the feedback to this work.
Well, we are in awe of your work and of the Heartbeat Opera. So thank you so much. I don't know if you want to say a final word on these productions. It has been stunning, and thank you so much for sharing those 2 pieces with us and allowing us to show them and share them with our seminar.
Absolutely, we're privileged to be here, and we hope folks will check out Breathing Free if they're interested. We will be sharing it again in the spring and onward. And so if folks have ideas about sharing the work too, please reach out.
Wonderful. We will. And Martin, we should talk about finding a way to show it in Frankfurt.
Yeah, sure. We will.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anaiis, Ras, and Ethan. Thank you.
Yes.
So there are many ways in which this is the perfect framing for our discussion, Martin, about the Frankfurt School on late capitalism. Not only because of the ways in which thinking about transforming our political economy was such a central part for W.E.B. Du Bois of the project of abolition democracy, but also because of the way in which what we just saw really transforms an art form in such a stunning way. Last session, we had the brilliant singer and composer Theo Bleckmann singing and composing new music for Bertolt Brecht's words and verses from the Threepenny Opera, of course, and Brecht was doing something very similar, I think, which was to transform the operatic form into a political weapon, in a way, very much in the way in which a heartbeat opera is transforming the operatic form into a political engagement, a deep political engagement. And in a way, responding to Adorno's critique, maybe. I mean, well, not directly, but I mean, effectively responding to the critique that he had leveled at opera as a kind of as a bourgeois form, and at Fidelio itself, which is problematic when you actually see that it's more of a kind of a retributive justice rather than real forward-looking justice opera. So the connections are many, and so I want to kind of invite you to help segue us then to these writings by Pollock, Neumann, and later Adorno and Marcuse on late capitalism, really.
Yeah, I will. Thank you. And the only thing to say in the beginning, of course, after these magnificent pieces is, it's always sad to be so dry after something that was not dry, but we'll have to be that, at least for a little bit. And of course, also spanning these decades that separate us from these texts also will mean having to read a little bit of dust out of these texts. And for those of you who've read them, these are not easy reads, and they're not easily adaptable to the mindset that we're trying to create here. And Bernard can tell you that I was a little bit reluctant also pressing the Frankfurt School texts or authors into the question of the abolition of capital, because my initial reaction was, this is not exactly what they're speaking to. And I still maintain or uphold this initial reaction, but I think it completely makes sense pressing them on this. And if maybe in the second half of our discussion, if we maybe are free and bold enough also to see what you can do with these things, even if they were meant otherwise, there might be something to be pulled out in terms of an abolitionist or similar project. But initially, this is a different context and a different question where we are starting. Friedrich Pollock, you just said a couple of words about him before, was one of the central figures in the institutional history of the Frankfurt School. He was a little bit overshadowed in his own scientific and academic work by the others, but this also has to do with some of the concerns that in a way later were projected onto this history and this specific late Marxist tradition and school. But in the 1930s and 40s, he was an absolute central figure also in terms of his writings. And the piece State Capitalism that was published in English in the journal in 1941, so this was already the Frankfurt School or the Institute in exile, was one of the most controversial pieces that ever appeared in the pages of the journal, that started in German but then ended up in English in the emigre years. And the piece in itself, it's extremely dry. And reading it, you would not think that it caused much of controversy. And it's also hard to locate where he's getting at. But interestingly enough, there is something that might speak to us today somehow. The context of it is, also if you look at the issue of the journal in which it appeared, are several analyses and historical studies of how to account for the specificity of the fascist states. So these are what in German was called Feindanalysen, analysis of the enemy, because all of us, of course, the emigre authors already had their jobs, many of them with the US State Department at the war at the time. So they were themselves engaged in social scientific work on Nazi Germany, and that at that point was a full-fledged war enemy already. And the idea was to try to contribute to better understand the inner workings, so let's say the logic of Nazi domination over its population and over its citizens. especially Kirchheimer, also Neumann, also Horkheimer, but then most famously Pollock, were trying to do this with a more schematic kind of approach. So many of them try to find labels and try to find certain models or metaphors for how this inner working of the fascist state could be elucidated. The state capitalism piece is part of this project, even if it doesn't really reference Nazi Germany so much. So it's meant to be a theoretical contribution to a theoretical discussion that is already underway at that time, where different types of state or government, or maybe even governmentality, were devised and compared and contrasted. And Pollock is trying to build what he himself calls, with a Weberian term, an ideal type, of which he was certain to claim that Nazi Germany, in a way, was one instance of it, but not the only one. So he calls state capitalism a model of government or a form of state that could be, if you start from more orthodox Marxist premises, deduced as a late stage of the inner development of a capitalist state, because following Marx, it is to be expected that capitalist states will fall prey to an increasing dynamic of monopolization. It makes sense for a capitalist economy to monopolize on certain districts or areas of the economy, and it makes sense that the capitalist state, so the political structures upholding and maintaining the capitalist mode of production, will increasingly foster and also defend the creation of monopolies. So Pollock deduces that at one point in time, we will see something like an almost convergence of economic and political interests, because the political structure will then create, build, and defend these monopolies with all political, juridical, and military means available. And he sees in Nazi Germany one instance of this, because he sees an economy that is running more or less on quasi-capitalist terms. There's still private firms and big conglomerations and enterprises running also the wartime economy. But he also sees a heavily interventionist political economic endeavor that is in a way orchestrated by the Nazi party and by the heads of state in a certain way, and that he sees in this a convergence of the political and economic powers, and he calls it state capitalism to make clear that it's a form of capitalism, but still one that is dominated by political imperatives. So, and already on the beginning, on the second page of the article, you can see that he contrasts state capitalism in the form he sees in the Nazi case with one that would succumb to democratic government or democratic control. And so he's interested in contrasting a more democratic against a more totalitarian form of state capitalism. What are the elements of this? Or how could you define state capitalism? And he gives a list of 5 different elements or constitutive pieces of it. The first is there has to be a general planning of the economy. The second is that prices are not free and flexible, but administered. The third is that profit or private profit is subordinated to plan. 4 is that the principles of scientific management prevail. And 5th, state power enforces the plan, so that there's no room for the, let's say, free play of market mechanisms, but there will always be a channeling through of state power in every instance of economic position making. So Pollock sees in a state capitalist system all social relations under command, as he calls it. And he says what you can see here in such a society is that people meet each other as commanders or commanded, not as buyers or sellers as you would have it in a more free, liberal, economic capitalist system. So the power in the hierarchy of the political system determines one's economic possibilities. There is complete control of production, and there's complete control of distribution. He ends the essay by asking, are there any economic, let's say, functional limits to this form of government that is also a form of economic enterprise? And he admits that what he can see and study in the case of wartime Germany is that it's premised on a wartime economy, so an economy that's driving towards the unleashing of, let's say, militaristic expansion. But he also says that in principle, this is a system that could function without inner or internal limits. And one could even imagine a totalitarian world state feeding from these principles. The penultimate question is, could this system be brought under democratic control? And his answer, tentatively at least, is yes. And on the ultimate page, he says, planning could overcome the handicaps of the market system by economic planning. And this could even be done or operated under democratic rule or democratic circumstances. So this, in 1941, is a highly ambivalent position to take. Imagine someone writing this on Germany in the US, implicitly comparing the capitalist, let's say, Western states to the Nazi state and concluding that there is, of course, a grave difference, but it's a difference in degree or in modus, not in principle. Because there is something like a hidden secret behind all of these different states, that they are late capitalist states, and the Nazi state makes no difference. The only strong difference is, of course, the Soviet Union. And he leaves open, and this is what was producing the anger of notably Horkheimer, whether the Soviet state could be compared to a more democratic planning state or not. But there seems to be at least the hint of, or the insinuation, that also, let's say, contemporary US economy is nothing else but a state capitalism under a different name, with a different conception, and sometimes maybe a couple of illusions about the freedom it would provide. So we have something like a really highly ambivalent analysis here that was highly contested for the value it brought for the understanding of the Nazi German state, because many were contesting the very fact that this is premised on exactly these kinds of logics or functionings. But then there's also this rather bizarre political ambivalence, whether the only difference that could be made politically is whether you can subordinate these kind of states to democratic control or not. So there's something like a maybe hidden, or at least potential pro-Soviet kind of prise de position. And this, of course, was provocative and not very welcomed by, let's say, the official line of the Institute that Horkheimer was always defending. But note first, and this is maybe for us the most interesting thing, a Frankfurt School type of analysis would always insist on the convergence or the proximity of the economic and the political forces. So this is not an economist or economistic kind of analysis, but it places the economic regime completely next to the political structures upholding and maintaining it. So there is something like a deep enmeshment of the economic and the political. And for Pollock, at least in this analysis, this is, let's say, the hidden logic, or maybe even the conceptual heart of state capitalism, that economical and political imperatives completely converge or dovetail, so that there's no other way of reorganizing economic forces or structure, if not also by fostering political forces. And democracy, of course, here is the term for exactly that kind of counterforce. Second, Pollock sees a non-capitalist logic even within a form of capitalism itself. On page 210 in my pagination, he says, management becomes virtually independent of, in scare quotes, capital in this form of state capitalism. And this just means that he sees that there is a form of instantiating or institutionalizing state capitalism that will move political and economic decision-making away from the position in which it makes a difference whether you hold or don't hold or have or possess capital. And that's an extremely interesting point, and maybe one that leads to something like an abolitionist possibility or potential, at least. This piece or article received a stormy reception, and this had to do with the more ideological overtones I was just alluding to. For Horkheimer, this was an analysis that sounded too orthodoxly Marxist or too Soviet-friendly, and Horkheimer was not happy with the Institute in exile, sounding like that they were defending the ideological sub-enemy of the US at the time. And there was some quarrel about even suppressing the publication from the journal, and that there were other things about whether this should become something like one of the most important pieces for the programmatic work of the Institute at the time. And this is all quite complicated and not easy to trace down, but much of it is in the letters and in the archives. But you can see that this is a highly original, and it's almost an early version of a totalitarian theory, a critique of totalitarianism that is a little bit so off the logic of the classical fascism versus anti-fascism schema. And Pollock definitely was going somewhere where a couple of other authors then in the 50s and 60s were going. There's one alternative to be found in Franz Neumann's analysis that sounds pretty similar in many, many respects, and the book Behemoth, The Structure and Practice of National Socialism, that was published in a first edition in 1942 and then in 1944 again, is extremely coherent, an extremely impressive work, by the way. And Neumann also tries to account for the specificity or the particular structure of the Nazi state. And he's also interested in the intertwinement of the legal, the political, the bureaucratic, and the economic order this state embodies. For the economic part, the keywords are organization, again, monopoly, and command. And what also Neumann is diagnosing is that there's a total dependence of economic actors on political structures. There's a total intertwinement of the economy, the bureaucracy, and state agencies. But for him, the interest in profit or private profit remains. The political monopolies determine money, credit, labor, and prices, but also profit from it. So there is a possessive or possessivist or even exploitivist logic even within this highly politicized economical structure. And this for Neumann has to do with the prehistory of the Nazi state in the Weimar Republic and the different forces competing with each other in the 1920s and early 30s. And he sees that the unions at the end of the Weimar Republic could not force the industry to do anything in their service, and National Socialism was benefiting from the support of the bourgeoisie and its organizations. And there's one quote I have from the middle from this chapter now in my retranslation from the German. National Socialism and great capital had identical interests as far as imperialist expansion is concerned. And therefore, there is something like a strategic alliance between great capital or great industry, as he says in Marxist terms, and the fascist political instances. So to conclude, for Neumann, there is nothing really capitalist in any meaningful way in this new behemoth structure. And he even says a couple of pages before that the very term state capitalism, so he's directly addressing Neumann, is a contradictio in adjecto. That means a meaningless term, a contradiction in itself. For him, it is a different kind of a compromise system in which pure Herrschaft, pure domination, finds a specific expression, but this for him is not tied to a strong or even particular specific economic philosophy. So Neumann, who was a direct colleague and co-thinker of Pollock at the time, makes a similar analysis, but draws a different conceptual conclusion. So the Nazi state is specific in its Herrschaftsform, in its mode or type of domination, and it's also the intertwinement or the integration of economic and political factors. But capitalism in any meaningful way is not part of the picture. But this is planning, and this is exploiting or reaping economic profit from several different activities and structures and processes, and they relate to private interest and private profit. But the capitalist imperatives do not go into this system, so they don't operate in the internal logic of the Nazi state, which is in that sense beyond the dividing line between a capitalist and a non-capitalist or even anti-capitalist state. And the so-called debate on state capitalism, in a way, was moving between these different poles. So the more orthodox position of Pollock's, and then a couple of objections that were that were similar in their structure to the ones that Neumann is raising by his counter proposal. And arguably, this very debate from the early and mid-40s was still influential for a couple of post-war political analyses, but not exclusively so, because the post-war situation was introducing a new political context and horizon, namely the Cold War and the rivalry of two forms of government and society that again were coded as pro or non-capitalist. And this, of course, was then the Cold War rivalry between the West and the Soviet Union. Herbert Marcuse's intervention in the mid-1960s, and One-Dimensional Man from '64, here, of course, is the seminal text, is starting from there. And his analyses of the oppressive nature of late capitalism as a system of domination that looks like a system of freedom takes on the technological social advancements of this regime. And he's, of course, writing this from California. He points, as many other Marxists of the time, to the quasi-utopian potential in technological revolution, and automation here, or machinery is the term. And he also, like many other, uses the so-called fragment on machines from the Grundrisse. And he also points to the possibility that a so-called third force or alternative might be coming from developing countries that could break the deadlock between the West and the Soviet Union. And this, of course, was the dream of the blockfreie Staaten, as we say in German. So the states were not completely tied up in the race for allies between the US and the Soviet Union at the time. So Marcuse has the idea that there will not be something in the economic system itself that might generate some kind of revolt or subversion, but it might come from the margins or from the more peripheral kind of environments. The Western welfare state for him has proven to be a state of unfreedom, even if it has led to a pretty high standard of living for the majority of the working population that is in a way bought into this kind of schema or regime. But its supposed freedom and plurality remain subjected, as he says, domination-like, and the Cold War has prevented any progressive experimentation with the development of productive forces that don't conform with the interests of private profit from happening. So what I want you to see is that this analysis also places its emphasis on the interlocking of economy and politics. So the regime of oppression that Marcuse is critiquing and attacking is not a purely economic regime, and it's not a purely authoritarian political structure, but it's exactly in the point of their convergence that it becomes so dangerous and so seductive at the same time. Because Marcuse is clear, it makes sense for the American worker not to revolt because he gets too much out of it. So capitalism has learned that it makes no sense disenfranchising the proletariat and not offering them something in return. And of course, the post-war boom societies in the US, but also in Western Europe, at least in some of the states, have offered something as a compensation to workers and the unions. And also, they were buying them out of their loyalty to the possibly more liberatory forces of the Eastern Bloc. And Marcuse seems to say that it's exactly that kind of ideological machinery that plays on economic compensation on the one hand, and on a certain kind of political normalization on the other, that has prevented any meaningful revolution or rebellion or even revolt against this kind of repression that the state cum economy system has exerted. And for him, the potential for disruption comes from the margins or from the outside. As I said, it's either developing countries, let's say in foreign affairs kind of a dimension, and in internal affairs, but this was not in that excerpt that we were read. So it's for him the excluded classes, then it's the excluded in terms of the gender division and the race division. And these are his famous remarks on the countercultural forces or countercultural subjects that in a way could be the only ones from which we could expect any kind of meaningful challenging of the system. Adorno's speech to the German Sociological Association in 1968, published in 1969, a locus classicus for Adorno's late sociological theory, is also dry and a not so accessible text, I fear, but I think it's easy to see the main argument. Adorno is presented with the analysis of the present that comes with the term industrial society that is advanced by most technocratic sociological thinkers in Germany at the time. And they want to get rid of a more Marxist vocabulary. And Adorno is just making a terminological case for the fact that we are still living in a kind of society dominated by class conflict that still deserves the name capitalism, and trying to obliterate that fact by just calling the whole thing differently, namely industrial society, for him is an ideological scam we should not fall prey to. And on the contrary, he seems to say, late capitalism is as oppressive as ever, or even more oppressive than it ever was. And then we have these famous Adornian dark moments where he says, this is a system of complete mediation, as he says, everything is one, or there's something like the gridlock of a universal fetishism that has affected all social relations at the same time. And therefore, it makes sense to attack that very society as a society that is capitalist to the core, because it is nothing but capitalist. All of its social relations are subordinated to the commodity form. So this is a rather grim diagnosis. The post-war Western societies are still capitalist, but they are not liberal anymore. And it could have been that they were, but at least now, 20 years after the war, 25, 28 years, they are not. The system is a coherent, interlocking totality with an utterly coercive character. It is, as a whole, an integrated system of domination, integrating ideological elements, technology, consumerism, and even conformist forms of social science. And in this speech, he, of course, attacks most of sociologies of the day as contributing this kind of ideological fog. So to conclude in 4 points on why should we read these texts and look at this tradition, searching for perspective, maybe fragments or lines of flight of abolition. First, the Frankfurt School is serious, thorough, and systematic in theorizing capitalism politically and never purely economically. This is a simple but crucial point. And this just means that this is late or maybe even post-Marxism, in that it defies and tries to shed all traces of economism. That means that capitalism is theorized not as an economic system that happens to be accompanied by certain political or cultural structures, but it is integrated and generated from and with them, or co-articulated, not only on an economic, but always already on a political, cultural, social, and maybe even corporeal form. And it might be interesting to think and theorize about abolition of capitalism analogously, never only as a way of just reorganizing economic practices, because capitalism itself, the thing you want to abolish, is not a simple economic entity or system either, but something more. Second, one strand within this tradition relies on a more orthodox Marxist kind of thought, namely that you could pose market versus plan, and that this would be an alternative among which you could choose. And this is something I think we can accuse Pollock of. Another strand, and I think Neumann might be the most interesting here, always theorizes hybrid regimes, but they are always, again, thought of in terms of social power that may or may not coincide with political power and that may or may not be driven by the interest in private profit. So for these thinkers, every economic institution, like the market, is always embedded, and the analysis will methodologically also always have to be an analysis of a social totality with the economy as just one moment. So this is a version of the first point. So the first point was the economic is always thought of as in relation to the political. The second is in a way the more methodological articulation of the same idea. Even something like the market that could be construed as a purely economic element within a totality will have to be analyzed in terms of being an element of a social totality that in its totality is either capitalist or not. And therefore, not only analysis, but also social practices attacking this capitalist element will always affect the rest of the total structure or the social totality. And this, of course, again, is nothing else than the dialectical structure of a Frankfurt School type of argument or analysis. Third, in this tradition then, resistance or subversion, let's say anti-capitalist practices, tend to be theorized in terms of either internal contradictions that arise contingently or necessarily, or interventions from the margins of the system. And this for me is the difference between Marcuse on the one hand and Adorno on the other hand. It's the other way around in my construal of this here. But the hope in a necessary overcoming of late capitalism by itself is never expressed. And again, this is a post-Marxist element in this still pretty Marxist kind of frame of thought. But no one, and especially Adorno, never relies on the process of history unfolding necessarily leading to something like the overcoming of capitalism by its own forces or by its own Totengräber, as Marx says. And this, of course, for me and to many others, marks the serious difference of this kind of outlook to, for example, the optimism of Antonio Negri and some of the other authors that are so in the horizon of our discussion today. So fourth, the grip of capitalism on us might be thought of as deep, let's say. Capitalism is a subjectivizing force that is hard to articulate and even harder to evade or fight off. Capitalism has come to be and always was a form of life, a Lebensform. It has made us who we are, and being those that we are, we will not change it easily, and this will not be a matter of political will alone, because it will involve and presuppose changing the whole of social relations as we know them. So we could fear, at least in the case of Adorno, that he would be pessimistic vis-a-vis a project that would think that thinking capitalism through easily leads to a political project abolishing. I wouldn't say that he would find it impossible or not worthwhile trying, but he would just say, this might be really, really hard. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. That was brilliant. I particularly appreciate the 4 final points you made, which I think are so important to this discussion, but also so powerful in interpreting these materials. I agree entirely with you. I agree entirely with you that Adorno's position in that piece and elsewhere, but in Late Capitalism or Industrial Society, is reflecting on the difficulty that we face, and in part because of the illusion that we live in an industrial society and that we've overcome class conflict, right? And so, I mean, the last few pages of that text are so strongly laced with this idea of this illusion that binds us. I mean, he uses that term so often. This illusion that binds us and in a sense imprisons us in the belief maybe that we have overcome a class conflict, and that the role of sociologists, I mean, and so he's speaking to sociologists, should be to unveil that spell, as he says, right, and to show the way in which actually relations of production relations of production remain kind of damaged in the way in which he's talking. So that was extremely helpful and enlightening. Well, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to pick up on one suggestion you made, which is that there is a possibly abolitionist dimension to Pollock's text. And I'd like to push on it and actually try to demonstrate what I see as the abolitionist piece there, the abolitionist element. And I actually, this is a bit of a Straussian reading of Pollock, but I think you have to do that precisely because of the reasons that you explained, which is that they are situated at Columbia. It's 1940s. They're there precariously. They're there almost in a way under a false guise, in the way that, I mean, they were brought as interdisciplinary social scientists. They were not brought as Marxists. In other words, so they had to, in a way, they had to hide that aspect in order to fit into Columbia and have a future here. And so I think one needs a slightly Straussian reading of Pollock, but when one does, I think that he, in a fascinating way, is actually describing the abolition of capital, because capitalists, in his definition of state capitalism, no longer are capitalists. They become, in his words, quote unquote, rentiers. Right. In fact, his usage of scare quotes around the term capitalist is fascinating in this particular text. And there's a way in which what he's trying to suggest is that with state capitalism and with government control and planning of the economy, the social function, I mean, he says this, the social function of the capitalist is transformed, disappears, and that in fact the capitalist is transformed into a rentier. So I just wanted to, I wanted to kind of flesh that out a little bit, and then also talk about Neumann. On this particular reading, then, what Pollock is proposing, which I think it fits perfectly with your reading, but it puts a little bit more pressure on that one point that you were suggesting. He is proposing a Weberian ideal type. He says it in the first footnote, a Weberian ideal type of state capitalism, that National Socialism in Germany should be understood as a new form of capitalism in the historical trajectory, in the periodizations of capitalism, right? We've achieved in Germany in 1920s, 30s, early 40s, a new form of capitalism, which he is calling state capitalism, and which you described well. And of course, he suggests that there are two possibilities of state capitalism: the totalitarian, so that's Nazi Germany, totalitarian state capitalism, but also possibly, with some questions, with some doubts, he's not sure, he's not that strong about this, but possibly, hopefully, a democratic form of state capitalism. Now, that democratic form of state capitalism is very interesting. First of all, as a preliminary basis, all of his discussion assumes that state planning, the planned economy, is an efficient mode of economic organization. Now, as we know, he had spent time in the Soviet Union. He had published a work in 27 or 28 on the Soviet Union and on planned economies. And throughout this piece, he is arguing that a centralized planned economy is efficient, is perfectly efficient. It's interesting when he drops footnotes to that he actually drops footnotes to the literature on socialist planning. All of the empirical bases for that claim are from the work on the Soviet Union. So, but he has this idea that a planned economy is efficient, which is why there is, in a way, a silver lining to totalitarian state capitalism. I mean, the silver lining is that actually this is a new form of possibly state capitalism, but we could push it in the direction of a democratically governed state capitalism. So, and it's when he's talking about what happens in this ideal type of state capitalism that he effectively describes an end of capital, an abolition of capital. Now, the reason is that, of course, in state capitalism, the state controls the credit system, the banks, money, currency, and in the process controls capital, he says. He explains, he writes, this is on page, on our text, it's on page 208, in the text that we linked to on the website. He explains this, that he says the state acquires the additional controlling power implied in complete command over money and credit. every investment, he says, whether it serves replacement or expansion, is subject to plan, and neither oversaving nor over-expansion, neither an investment strike nor, you'll have to help me, Fehlinvestitionen can create large-scale disturbances. Now, so when you dig deeper, then the state control of the entire financial system entails an end to capital, and it's fascinating that Pollock puts the term "the capitalist" in those scare quotes. This is on page 209. The capitalist in state capitalism becomes nothing more than a rentier, someone who gets a rent from his property, and a rent that could be, stabilized as rents can be in New York City and elsewhere. So Pollock writes about this transformation of the quote unquote capitalist in the following way. And this is on page 209. He writes, "The rigid control of capital, whether in its monetary form or as plant, machinery, commodities, fundamentally transforms the quality of private property in the means of production, and its owner, the quote, his quote, capitalist, unquote." And it's here that you get this sense that the capitalist becomes a rentier. So it's in the paragraph right there on page 209, where he writes, "Regulation of prices, limitation of distributed profits, compulsory investment of surplus profits in government bonds or in ventures, which the capitalists would not have chosen voluntarily, and finally, drastic taxation." All of these measures converge to the same end, namely, to transform the capitalist into a mere rentier whose income is fixed by government decree as long as his investments are successful, but who has no claim to withdraw his capital if no interests are paid, he writes. Now, that's a fascinating notion. It's a fascinating notion of a new form of a government-controlled, a planned economy, which effectively plans capital return or transforms capital into mere obligation, which is capped and determined and fixed, right? He even says that in totalitarian state capitalism, capitalists will eventually disappear, and because their social function is now because it becomes nil. They lose their social function. Now, that's where it becomes very interesting, because he's using the literature on socialist planning to defend this form of state capitalism, and then he, of course, and he places himself explicitly against Hayek and alongside Oscar Lange. So he's taking position in this literature about planned economies, but what he argues for with this democratic form is the same thing, but that it would be controlled by the people rather than by the totalitarian state. So one has to think that, in fact, one would have the same transformation of the capitalist into a rentier, but it would be done in a democratic process. And it's remarkable because actually, when you look at that and you push it, you see that he actually says that this would do away with economics, right? He writes, this is on page 217, he writes, "Economic problems in the old sense no longer exist when the coordination of all economic activities is affected by conscious plan instead of by natural laws of the market. What we have instead is mere administration," right? So we've replaced economics and we've replaced capitalism by administration. And his hope, of course, is that you would be able to have a democratically controlled version of this. In fact, that's his only hope. In fact, that's the only way he seems to suggest that National Socialism will be defeated, by showing the possibility of this, of successful democratic controlled planned economies. Now, he uses the term democratic, but I think that I think that, you know, it's important to place this in that historical context. Being at Columbia in a precarious situation where most of the American discipline that he's speaking to is staunchly anti-communist and would balk completely if he sounded Marxist. So he's using the language of democracy and democratized state capitalism. I think I hear it as really it's social democratic. It's a social democratic controlled state capitalism, which, you know, wouldn't be far from something that could be thought of as socialist, but of course he couldn't use those words. So that's where I agree with you, and I would just kind of like to try and flesh out exactly what that abolitionist element is in there. Is that he envisages, in a fascinating way, the abolition of capital, because capital becomes rent in a way. It becomes an obligation simply in an administered economy. Now, Neumann, as you suggested, of course, is the contrasting pole in this debate. Here too, on a slightly Straussian reading, he too turns to democracy, to the notion of democratic transformations and to the need to have a successful democratic economy, also as the only way to defeat National Socialism. His Marxism is much more orthodox, though, although it was not received as such in the American context. But you have to say that when you look at Behemoth and you look at the last paragraph, right? He has in a way masked his Marxism sufficiently that, wrapping it in his righteous indignation of the Nazi form of governing, in such righteous indignation that you almost don't see or hear his Marxism. But I think he lets it through, or he lets it escape in that last paragraph where he writes, this is on page 476 of my book, but in any event, it's the last paragraph of the book, whatever version anybody has. It's the flaws and breaks in the system and even the military defeat of Germany will not lead to an automatic collapse of the regime. It can only be overthrown by conscious political action of the oppressed masses, which will utilize the breaks in the system. Now, the term oppressed masses is I mean, that's a signal, and it's a signal, in fact, that would be more explicitly the way to interpret the penultimate paragraph, where he sets forth his vision of how one has to engage in propaganda against the National Socialist government, and of course, precisely, and it's because of this insightful kind of psychological warfare perspective that he'll become, that he'll be integrated into the OSS and form part of basically the United States kind of intelligence and propaganda arm against Germany. But when he writes in the middle of that penultimate paragraph, right, the National Socialist leadership knows that once England and the American democracies will show themselves as efficient as, and perhaps more efficient than National Socialism, while retaining or even deepening democracy, the belief in National Socialism founded on fear and despair will ultimately collapse. The primary condition for psychological warfare against Germany is therefore that the process of democratization in England and the United States be not sacrificed, but that it be encouraged to progress. Now, the process of democratization, right? Now, what does that mean, the process of democratization? He says, well, we know it's difficult. It is much more strenuous to develop the potentialities of a nation on a democratic than on an authoritarian basis, yet to uproot National Socialism in the minds of the German people, the model of an efficiently operated democracy will be worth as much as a powerful army. Again, like Pollock, the way you're going to do it is by showing the efficiency of democracy. But what do we mean by making US more democratic? That ties into an American discourse of democracy theory, which is very, classic, mainstream, democratized. But I think what he means by democratizing the American economy is that signal that he gives in the last sentence about the conscious political action of the oppressed masses, which obviously is more orthodox Marxist. Now, he, of course, so as you were suggesting, he offers a very different model of where we are with National Socialism in Germany, in part because he wants to argue that actually this is not a state, right? So this isn't state capitalism because Germany in 1940 and 41 is not a state, he wants to say. It's not, there's no coherent political theory. It draws on any kind of political thought in a purely instrumental and a purely elastic way, as a pure form of propaganda, he argues, right? There's no law, there's no rule of law. So he wants to argue that this is not a state. Of course, if it's not a state, then we can't have state capitalism. I mean, what does he propose instead? He proposes instead the term totalitarian monopolistic capitalism is the term that he expressly proposes. This is on page 261. I have the old 1942 original Oxford edition here, page 261 in this one, where he says, the German economy of today has two broad and striking characteristics. It is a monopolistic economy and a command economy. It is a private capitalistic economy regimented by the totalitarian state, although he's being imprecise with the use of state there, totalitarian state. I would say it was totalitarian regime. We suggest as a name best to describe it, totalitarian monopoly capitalism. So what he's suggesting is that contra Pollock, we're not in a new phase of capitalism. We're in just the most deviant, the most distorted, kind of a Frankenstein version of late monopolistic capitalism, governed by this regime that is not a state, but is simply a purely power grabbing elite or leader.
Yeah.
So from the perspective of kind of like the periodization of capitalism, it is, as you suggest, a very different story. We haven't entered into a new phase. We're just seeing the collapse. In fact, from the orthodox Marxist perspective, what he's saying, and he says this in a few places, is that actually this is inevitable, right? This is where monopolistic capitalism takes you. Let me find that passage again, where he says that he actually says that this is the logically entailed, really. This is on page 354 of my version, and I've tried to write all this up, and I will post it. I couldn't get it posted in time, but eventually this will be. I'll have these sections so you can, so that everyone in the seminar can refer to them more. He writes this is kind of like the description of the profit motive in the command economy, where he says in a totalitarian, in a monopolistic system, page 254, in a monopolistic system, 4 lines down, profits cannot be made and retained without totalitarian political power. And that is the distinctive feature of National Socialism, right? I mean, that's powerful. I mean, he's saying, like late capitalism, he's calling it monopolistic capitalism, that it cannot be made and retained without totalitarian political power. If totalitarian political power had not abolished freedom of contract, the cartel system would have broken down. If the labor market were not controlled by authoritarian means, the monopolistic system would be endangered. If raw material supply, price controls, etc., if credit and exchange controls were in the hands of forces hostile to monopolies, the profit system would break down. And so what he says is, in short, a democracy would endanger the fully monopolized system. And he writes, it is the essence of totalitarianism to stabilize and fortify it. In other words, so this is a pretty orthodox Marxist view that monopoly capitalism is going to lead to kind of totalitarianism. This is inevitable kind of Frankenstein capitalism, late stage monopoly capitalism. Totalitarianism is just part of it. And of course, one couldn't then have anything like a democratic equivalent, the way that Pollock is trying to test out. Right? Yeah. Okay, so now, but what's interesting is that then on this reading, Pollock has an idea of abolishing capital, turning it into rent, basically. And of course, Neumann has a much more classical, possibly Marxist view of what we need, which is the oppressed classes rising up and creating true democratic, i.e., dictatorship of the proletariat, in a sense. I mean, dictatorship of the workers, which would of course eventually go as well towards this towards an abolition of capitalism. So those are remarkable, and as you suggest, of course, Adorno and Horkheimer were difficultly situated. They were actually difficultly situated with regard to both of these proposals. I mean, I think that they thought that they thought that Neumann was too orthodox Marxist, I think, from the correspondence, and I think that they thought that Pollock was not sufficiently dialectical. So he wasn't in any way dialectical with these categories. And it's of course the dialectics that Adorno, as you were suggesting, comes back to at the end with this question of whether we are late capitalism or industrial society, where what he wants to show is no, actually it's the fact that we think that we are in a non-class, no longer the struggle for class struggle, industrial condition, when in fact the relations of production are as damaged as they have always been, that we don't see it. It's the dialectical conflict that we don't see, that's hidden from us, and that is the biggest problem today. Interesting. Interesting that he suggests that the student movements. This is 68, right? The last time the first time we had our seminar together, we were looking at his notes, his marginalia on theory and praxis. There's this interesting little note in Adorno at the end where he seems to suggest actually that the countercultural movement might be the way forward, suggesting a somewhat much more sympathetic reading of the kind of student resistance of the late 1960s. Okay. Where am I going with this? Well, let me quickly wrap up. I think that the Pollock-Neumann debate is fascinating, not only for this foreshadowing or prefiguring an idea of abolishing capital or abolishing capitalism, but also, of course, historically for tracing the different ways in which capitalism is transformed from late or monopoly capitalism to national socialism and possibilities there, which is of course relevant to us in a number of ways today, not only because we need to think about how capitalism today takes its form, what form it is today, which many people speak of neoliberal forms of capitalism, but that would be something that we could investigate, in part following with this long history. Nancy Fraser talks about financialized capitalism. I mean, there are different diagnoses of the condition that we are in now, but it would be important for us, I think, to trace these periodizations also and see what role for this form of state capitalism. I find, and along those dimensions, I find it brilliant that, and you find this in Pollock, and you find it in Adorno as well, that they don't really buy the distinction between a laissez-faire period where the state did not intervene and now state intervention. I mean, Adorno is clear about that in his essay, but that's just a myth, right? It's the illusion of free markets that is written all over that piece. But it would help us then to figure out what we need to understand in terms of neoliberal form of capitalism today. And then also, two other points in terms of relevance for our discussion. One has to do with the role of cooperation, and this is where I think that the work ties in an interesting way. I tried to point this out in the in my introductory post. To W.E.B. Du Bois's writings on a separatist, cooperative Black nation, which he was arguing for in 1935. There's actually a real parallel between the way in which Pollock and Neumann are arguing that the only way forward is to demonstrate the success of a democratic form of economy, and Du Bois, who argues the only way forward is to separate, create a nation within a nation, have a cooperative society, and show that that can be perfectly economically effective and
competitive,
and competitive. And that's the only way that there's going to be equality among the races. So that's an interesting parallel. And then finally, the last but much darker parallel. And I intend to try to write more about this, is that as I was reading Neumann and his book, The Behemoth, which but for everyone else, I mean, the notion of the behemoth is the irrational state giant by contrast to the well-ordered Leviathan, right? In Hobbes's two different books. But the way that he describes the behemoth as this non-rational, purely instrumental, chaotic, kind of elastic ideology, propaganda, which goes in any direction as long as it works for a minute, really makes me think of the last 4 years of our political existence in the United States and the Trump presidency, which mercifully will end in January. But we had a lot of debate in this country about whether or not it was proper to call this country fascist or to call President Trump fascist. And in a way, I think that debate was a bit of a red herring that distracted us from the more important comparison, which is in this Neumann book, of a non-state, of an entity that governs, but it doesn't govern with a coherent political theory. It doesn't have a political theory. It uses absolutely any device, any argument, any weapon for pure political purposes, and that's what we've lived through. Now, I mean, I've tried to force coherence on this Trump presidency through models of counterinsurgency and white nationalism and white supremacy, but I think that's all right. But more than anything, looking back over it, it was just this, all over the place, non-rational, no coherence to it. Anything that works to get the news cycle on today's news cycle, basically. So that every day there had to be something completely different that would get all of our attention. And in that sense, I think this work is particularly relevant and helpful in enlightening a little bit what we have lived through over the last 4 years. So anyway, those are some thoughts, a lot of thoughts. I mean, I think this work is so challenging and theoretically inspiring. Pollock, I mean, the Neumann book is just fascinating. You understand well why it was actually so well received here in the United States, and why Neumann, in a way, ends up being the best, the most welcomed in the American context, in part because of the hidden Marxism.
Yeah, but he had shedded all of his Marxist skins by the end of the war, and
yeah,
so and he was in a way also compatible to other discourses that he was trying to align himself with. But that would be a different story. Bernard, before we turn to the audience, let us just hold on to the only point where we disagree.
Okay.
And this is whether critical theory in the Frankfurt sense allows for what you are passionately interested in at the moment, namely pitching cooperation against capital.
Okay.
And actually claiming or forging even an instrument which would be the beginning of a way out. So my reading of the late Adorno is, in a way, against this. But this is, of course, the typical negativistic, maybe even pessimistic trope that is also characteristic of this tradition of thought. They would say, or Adorno would say, since capitalism is not this one thing many people do, and it has to do with money and production, but is much more, it could be that the whole social world is, in the meantime, so capitalist that every form of cooperation will also be tainted or infected by this trait. And therefore cooperation as a different or alternative social practice is no way out but part of it, mediated, as the Hegelian says here. And now you would have to say something like, this is true, but you can try, or this is where we start. And these new practices will then create different social worlds that, when they gain traction, will gain a momentum that might become a hammer against the iron cage of what we live at the moment. And I think this is a position you, Negre-Hart, and some of the other communist or the commons-oriented theorists at the moment try to make really strong. And I see it, and all I wanted to say is, within these late or post-Marxist discourses, there remains the more skeptical or pessimistic strand that will not think that this is at least possible by political will. So this will entail or presuppose the restructuring of a whole social cosmos, let's say, of which then cooperative practices will only be one element. But this is just another way of saying abolition is difficult.
No, I agree, and I think you are entirely right that the cooperation paradigm as against capitalism is not. I don't see it either in these writings. I don't see it either in these writings. in part because of the difficulty of expression or honesty that they faced, given the historical conditions that they were living through. But regardless of that, I think that these proposals are far more classically oriented towards either state planned economies, or some kind of dictatorship of the people, of workers, which are much more classic alternatives. And there isn't that much here in terms of the cooperation that I'm pushing for in my work. And in part, I think, in part, as we were thinking about what to read and to focus on, I think that there was more of it's a little bit square peg and round hole that we're dealing with here. These materials don't perfectly intersect with the cooperation, Russian or my argument for cooperation, with the exception, though, that interesting Du Bois link having to do with with the argument that cooperatives as a separatist nation within the nation could actually be economically competitive, could actually be an economic, and there's something. But I agree that there isn't much of a notion of cooperation in here. And of course, the cooperation that I'm proposing is somewhat different from the other suggestions for the common, the new work on the common, whether it's Pierre Dardot and Christian Laval's book, The Common, or Hart and Negri's work in Commonwealth and in Assembly, which laid much of the groundwork for that, because those notions of the common are different. I mean, although they intersect notions of cooperation, particularly in the context of intellectual property and copyleft and Creative Commons and whatnot, they're not based on elements of cooperation so much as they're, well, let's say cooperation is important to the common. You can't have a common without cooperation, but that's not the privileged dimension of the common. Okay, that's good. Now hold on, before I turn it back to you, let me just say for the audience, we should be turning to the questions and answers. So everyone, all the students who are on, turn on your videos. Anyone who is an attendee wants to pose a question, send a message. You can pose them in the Q&As, and we've got a few that we should address. You can also ask Fonda to put you put you on the screen so you can ask your question. Send a message to Fonda if you'd like to do that. So yeah, we should get more folks into the panel. I see Ivan. Hi, Ivan. How are you doing? Good. You're muted right now. Ivan
Hey.
Was on the panel on the first and the second of our abolition democracies. It's great to see you. Others as well. Please free to, particularly students in the seminar, feel free to turn on your videos and join us. So I wanted to give you, Martin, an opportunity to respond to that while we start collecting questions. And also, Ivan, do you want to jump in at this point, or no?
I think we should move on to questions and suggestions from the audience, because they might also stitch these different elements together differently than we do.
Yeah.
But I agree on also the need then to differentiate, let's say, the commons perspective from the cooperation perspective, and also the question of scale. And you're right. So these texts that we read address the system question. And it could be that these more separatist elements are different because they exactly propose to change the scale and change the sites where you would expect subversion or revolt to happen. And that would be interesting in this, having also, let's say, a map or a cartography of different suggestions where things could happen and whether they would immediately connect to all the other parts of the system or not. And there it would be different to place the different Frankfurt School thinkers, and Marcuse being the one that would be, I think, closest to changing the scales and changing the topologies, whereas Adorno in this is thinking grand scale,
right?
Thinking, systems like,
yeah. So we've got some questions from Yanis Tsirigakis, which we can jump on. Ivan, I wanted to give you an opportunity though to jump in if you wanted to as well. Otherwise, otherwise we'll why don't we in the Q&A we can all see some of the questions. Maybe I'll and this has to do a lot with these questions of white nationalism in the Trump presidency today. Some of the questions from Yanis is, do you think that the absence of ideology by the Trump administration is an example to follow? Politics is the art of the feasible, not trying to impose nebulous and ill-defined, misconceived theoretical. And how do we think about white nationalism versus other forms of political ideologies, and also the question of anti-fascism. So this, of course, pushes our discussion very much into the contemporary moment. But I think that's important for this, for our reading of these texts, because it has to be the case that they have contemporary relevance to this situation. And I do think it's the Neumann text more than any of the others that speak to this particular moment of the single-term Trump administration.
Leo Löwenthal would have been the next to read, and Löwenthal on the False Prophets, which is a study of early post-war US political campaigns, is utterly enlightening, and it's fascinating to see. And he already has like an ideology critique of the self-made man and of business people turning politicians and all of these kind of things, and the populist rhetoric that we might have seen. But that would have been another trajectory.
Does anyone want to jump in? I want to make sure that we're not monopolizing the conversation too much. Are there other ways in which you see kind of these different strands playing out today? Anyone who either make a sign to me, or you can raise your hand in the Zoom function, and we can bring you in. What this work really does in terms of periodizations is challenge us to think about the transformation of capitalism and how as it has been transformed, what we confront today in a way. That was the effort that they were engaged in. That was the debate that they were engaged in. And I think that that's what makes this so relevant. Sarah Bianchi has a question. It would be great, Sarah, if you could join us in person to ask your question. I think Fonda can do some trick so that you can turn on your video. I'll while Fonda's doing that, Sarah, and before you while you're coming on the video, I'll read your question, which is clarificatory questions. And in continuation to the Frankfurt seminars, I'd be interested in further understanding from where resistance could come. If we understand capitalism with Foucault of the punitive society, oh, there you are, Sarah. I'm reading your question for you. Why don't you go ahead and pose it yourself? You can unmute and pose the question. And thanks for joining us live, as it were.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yes, my question was one that is in continuation to the Frankfurt seminars that we had the last years with you at the Social Institute. And with Marcuse, that was Martin Saar talked about, we can understand resistance from the margins of society. And with Foucault of the punitive society, we can understand capitalism as a social form that affects, meanwhile, the whole society. And my question would be then, how can we then, from within this social prison, conceive and experience resistance, so that not from the margins, but yes, as part from the capitalist machinery somehow.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think, Martin, that picks up on your third the third point you were making at the end of your presentation, and the difference between Adorno and Marcuse on those questions. Do you want to elaborate also, and how it would tie into? I mean, our next session is going to be on the punitive society. So thanks, Sarah, for bringing that up, because we are in a way going to be moving from the Frankfurt School to Foucault and the punitive society. Martin, any thoughts on?
Yeah, just let's say more an architectonic remark. It could be that Foucault is proposing a third option. The first two being resistance is internal and systemic to a social totality. That's, for me, the Adorno position. Or second, a social totality of oppression produces outsider or marginality positions that will express themselves as subversive or revolting. That's the Marcuse position. The Foucault position could be an oppressive social system produces internally cracks or dysfunctionalities or irregularities that are not, as in the first models, mere moments of the functioning of oppression, but are counter mechanisms, counter practices. So this is how I would think it. These are three different types of, it's just a conceptual distinction. It's nothing diagnostic, I would say. It's just conceptually speaking, trying to account for the fact where resistance comes from when it doesn't come from somewhere completely outside. And the first for me is the classical dialectical position. The second is something like an insider-outsider dialectic, maybe. And the third is probably non-dialectical. But we would have to flesh that out in terms of the examples these authors give. But the hard, let me just repeat this. The hard Adornian line would be, it's no wonder, but also nothing to be applauded, to seek applaud for when complex pluralist societies also create subversive practices and subjects. This will be part of the game, and this will be part of the very functioning of a well-ordered, well-functioning oppression regime. So this sounds cynical, but I think it's Adorno's position.
Sarah, what do you think? How would you read the punitive society then, possibly as a way to kind of make some sense of this or offer a different perspective?
I'm not sure whether I would read it in non-dialectical terms. I would maybe I would try to understand how the subject could relate or could develop an attitude or a different attitude towards the power knowledge nexus. I would frame it this way: the capitalist order, and there we have the rationalist knowledge of the logics of production, and the power nexus that binds the subjects to these logics. And then maybe the dialectics would be in that way that the subject that is blind to see these logics is excluded, to call the term from the punitive society. But at the same time, he is not, the subject is not always excluded. It can somehow develop different ways to set a relation to these logics from within.
Yeah. I suppose in terms of our readings, the readings that we have in front of us here, we don't have a very focused, detailed description of forms of subjective resistance here, right? In part that's because of the selections that we've chosen, right? I think the closest you get is to somehow reading into Adorno's discussion precisely of the students, or I read it as students or something, of the resistance of the counter movement. So this is on page 245 of the Late Capitalism or Industrial Society, right, where he writes, the very core of the individuation is beginning to dissolve. In recent years, on the other hand, traces of a counter movement have also become visible, primarily among the most diverse sections of the youth, namely resistance to blind conformism, freedom to opt for rationally chosen goals, disgust with the condition of the world as the hoax and illusion it is, and an awareness of the possibility of change, right? And so I suppose, I mean, to return to these materials, it would have to be in the interstices of these expressions that one would find something to think about the forms of resistance and the role of subjectivity, right? So about conformism, resistance to conformism, disgust with the illusions, awareness of change. But although, of course, we'd have to be reading a lot into just that one small section. Because I don't think that there's much. I mean, the Pollock is a very different form of scholarship, and the Neumann book is doesn't go in that direction. Right? Yeah. I don't know. So Lowenthal, you were suggesting, Martin. But what other texts here by these authors do you think would be the most useful?
Marcuse on the changing of sensibilities is also, of course, this would be a trajectory into the problem that Saar is raising of how to explain or account for the mechanism that makes subjects change their minds and turning against the very powers that made them. And whereas I was suggesting that Adorno has nothing to offer but, let's say, the despair vis-a-vis a well-integrated, complete mediation. Marcuse would be the one that has these counter practices, counter sensibilities, and sees them seeping into the system from the margins, from the social margins, and also, let's say, from the cultural and national margins. So this whole idea that the developed countries have other cultural resources, and this was also in the text we read. This might sound a little suspicious to us today, but this is something he deeply held. So the idea that different cultural backgrounds give you different resources, also to resist to homogenization of the Euro-Atlantic norm, let's say. So there would be something, yeah.
Sonia, did you have a question? I've got Yannis as well, who was going to turn on his video and ask his question. Yannis, please feel free to turn on your video.
Well, if Yannis can go ahead first, that'd be great.
Okay. Yannis, are you there? You are. Okay, great. Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you for this discussion. I had several questions. Let me pose the last one about the interplay between culture and the economy, because we criticize the economy, but the recent events show us that culture is more important than whatever we theorize the economy, the economic system functions as.
Right. Okay. Great.
And the corollary to that has to do with that with the last comment, the last point that was made, that the main strand of anti-capitalist rhetoric today is coming from the top, is coming from the elites, from those that seemingly have benefited from the economic system, which we call capitalist, and they're the ones who are the spearheads of the anti-capitalist praxis today. You see, like the tech CEOs, academia, and all these people. But the people who are supposedly the victims of the capitalistic mode of the economy do not seem to be joining that rhetoric, actually, and they seem to be on the opposite ends, politically at least. So I would like some comment on this antinomy, because I cannot put it together.
No, I think that's really important, because Martin, maybe you could address that, because the first point you made, and it was really the first of the four final points you made, was precisely about this question of political versus economic, right? But in there, we didn't use the category of cultural, which of course is deeply well, it's what Neumann is, where Neumann is going with all of this, all of the question of the psychological and the propaganda and culture, and of course where the Frankfurt School is and goes. So do you want to address that point?
Yeah, I might. In my lexicon, the term culture probably has a different place, but probably there is something that is similar. Of course, we would say this is a matter of, let's say, discourse, self-understanding, maybe even identity. And
are you suggesting that it's part of politics for you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah. So, but I might be mistaken, and it might be that other people have different connotation when they hear culture. But the other point was, I think, also interesting and for us challenging. Why do the people that the theorists construe as the disadvantage from these systems, why are these not the people who revolt first? And why are the intellectuals who are the most of the times profiteers from it, at least the well-paid intellectuals, the ones calling for subversion and revolt? And this is, of course, a classical topos. The Frankfurt School was reacting to this, of course, with the notion of ideology or ideology-alike kind of structures that some people don't know that they are disenfranchised, and they would know if they would read certain analyses or not. And the others would be, so the other strand would be, there are certain experiences that push people towards revolt or subversion. And sometimes exactly these kind of experiences are manipulated or muted. And this is a very important topos in Adorno from the 50s, that he says the people don't really seem to experience their own impoverishment of experience. And this is, let's say, the ultimate triumph of the capitalist system, that it can even, in a way, brush over the impoverishment of experience that comes with economization, standardization, homogenization, and all these kind of things. So people think that certain consumerist advancements in their standard of living, in a way, outweigh what they have, in a way, lost. And this is, I think, a really interesting, maybe not ultimate, but interesting thought also for our contemporary culture, where political losses sometimes are not felt and not seen and not experienced. And this, of course, also has to do with what might call culture or discourse or articulation. And this is also something I think political theory would have to address, of the mutedness of certain also experiences of disadvantage or non-privilege. And sometimes these are not things that are obvious. Yeah, it's sometimes these are under the carpet, so to say. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great, good. We're running out of time. Actually, we're a little bit past time. But Sanya had one last question. So maybe why don't we take that, and then we'll close. We'll end with Heartbeat Opera again. Sanya.
Thank you. To first start where you left off with saying the question of the feeling of oppression, of not being felt, and I'm wondering if you would consider that as the aggregation of that feeling, and particularly what I am asking you to address is this notion of how globalization or forces of globalization are easy to appropriate for survival of capitalism and politics of capitalism, rather than for interventions against it, such as movements like BLM. And here I'm particularly thinking about Code of Capital, and Professor Katharina Testor has written a wonderful book about it. And the nature of coding capital and giving it this well-coded roving capacity to roam the globe free, this sort of elusive nature now that capital has taken on. So how do we, in trying to develop interventions against this system, where would we even begin to locate? And I'm going to use a term by Professor Balabar. He used that last time at the last seminar. Where would we even locate an insurrection against these systems that are now elusive and, well, roving all over the world, protected by this code, enabled by law and politics?
That's a good way to. That's a tough question,
yeah.
But it is a good way maybe for us to bookend our seminar, if there is a beginning of a sketch of an answer, perhaps.
I'll also give a non-satisfactory first schematic answer. The Frankfurt School analyses at least prevent us from putting hopes at the wrong place. And this just means that these kind of critical analysis we were delving into at least would suggest that if capitalism is what they think it is and was and will be, there will be neither hope to be placed in globalizing the thing nor in localizing it. So it's probably in such a way, so it's mediated in such a way that probably it has internally a dialectical structure, and that means that it cannot be broken as a whole, but also not be broken in the restricted locality alone. But there will have to be a multidimensional strategy that will involve universalizing, globalizing elements, but that will also involve disintegrative or disruptive elements. And both simplistic strategies are bound to fail, because the system of domination also is already both a universal, as in the alluding to the things you were referring to, a globalizing coding element and a singularizing, particularizing element. And this is what Adorno was thinking about, let's say, the logic of capitalist domination, that it works on both levels and ends. And Foucault, I think, had the same idea when he said that a certain type of power is totalizing and individualizing at the same time. But this also means that fighting it will also have to involve strategies or weapons or tools in both directions, or on both scales, or in both dimensions. But this is just a schematic answer that doesn't tell you what to do or what to organize or where to organize, but it at least says that a political analysis and a political strategy premised on these quasi-dialectical, maybe negative dialectical models will at least help us to not be illusory, let's say, or not self-deceptive on that level. That's a first answer. It's preliminary. I'm sorry. Yeah. Bernard, you have to wrap up.
No, yeah, I got to wrap up. It's getting late, and it's even later in Frankfurt. So yeah, I would say there are two directions to answer that. One is to be imagining the spaces where we would want to be, which is maybe the effort of cooperation. The other is to imagine how to get there through processes of insurrection or others. Yes, so we need to wrap up our seminar. This has been another extraordinary conversation. Martin, thank you so much for co-hosting.
Thank you. Yeah.
For jointly running this seminar. It has been really incredibly rich. And so I want to thank you. I want to thank everyone else for participating, everybody who also didn't turn on your videos. I understand it's a little bit, with the pandemic and whatnot, everybody's at home. So, but thank you all for being here. We're going to close simply. I want to say just thank you. And so we're going to close on a note to transcend the punitive society. I hope you'll join us next time. It'll be on January 7th, I believe. There'll be a slide with the exact times. Yes, it's on, the next one is on, so we got a small mistake. It's something like January 7th. It's on the website in any event. So we'll close now again with Heartbeat Opera. Thank you so much. Thank you, Fonda. Thank you all.
Thank you.
I wanted to talk to you about taking on some more responsibility. What serious enemies.
Don't take Lee down there with you. She doesn't need to see that.
On the contrary, show me the way.